Thanks for joining me for today's video Bible study. My name is Ryan Goodwin. I preach for the East Shelby Church of Christ in Collierville, Tennessee. You can find more information about our congregation at eastshelby.com. As always, if you have questions or comments, you can leave them in the comments section below. So we're going to be in the book of Ecclesiastes, and this will be our last video Bible class from this Old Testament book. We'll be looking at both chapter 11, which is pretty short, and chapter 12, which is the conclusion to Solomon's thoughts on this subject. So let's begin in Ecclesiastes chapter 11 and verse 1. Cast your bread on the surface of the waters, for you will find it after many days. Divide your portion to 7 or even to 8, for you do not know what misfortune may occur on the earth. If the clouds are full, they pour out rain upon the earth. And whether a tree falls toward the south or toward the north, wherever the tree falls, there it lies. He who watches the wind will not sow, and he who looks at the clouds will not reap. Just as you do not know the path of the wind and how bones are formed in the womb of the pregnant woman, so you do not know the activity of God who makes all things. Verse 6. Sow your seed in the morning. Do not be idle in the evening. For you do not know whether morning or evening sowing will succeed, or whether both of them alike will be good. Now, at first, it seems like this is just some good business sense that Solomon is sharing with his readers. And I do think there's some merit to that. When you take a look at the advice that he's offering here, this is good stuff. This is good information that if you were a business owner or you were an investor, if you were somebody who was having to manage a portfolio or manage a lot of different business ideas, then of course, what Solomon is saying is true. Conventional business wisdom is lined up with this for generations. Take a look again at verses 1 and 2. Cast your bread on the surface of the water, you'll find it after many days. He's saying, make an investment now, and it will pay off. Not immediately, not tomorrow, but after many days, that investment will come back around and pay off for you. Of course, Solomon had some personal experience in this. He built ships and he had trade relations with other kingdoms. So he knew that when he made an investment with a kingdom that might have been very far-flung, far away from his kingdom, that it would take some time. He could invest money or grain or other things and ship them to another kingdom. And in return, those ships would come back full of other products. So be in it for the long haul is what he's saying. Be willing to make an investment and be patient about seeing how that investment unfolds. Diversify in verse 2. Divide your portion to 7 or even to 8 because you don't know which one's going to work out. And if you throw all your eggs into one basket, and that's the basket that happens to fall apart, well, you've lost everything. So if you do have money to diversify, then do it. If you have the ability to make investments in a lot of different things, well, then you should follow those different pursuits. And again, that's just good business sense. That's just good financial wisdom. If the clouds are full, they pour out rain. Whether a tree falls toward the south or toward the north, wherever the tree falls, there it lies. There are just some things in business that you can't change. Some things just are what they are. There are things that are out of your control. If a competitor somehow or another stumbles upon a great idea that puts you out of business, well, it just is what it is. If the stock market crashes, it crashes not because of what you've done personally, but because of what 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 other people or other investors have done. There are just some things that are out of your control, and you can either accept them as reality, accept them as fact, and work within that framework of reality, or you can fight against it and, again, lose everything. And he goes on to say in verse 4, he who watches the wind will not sow, he who looks at the clouds will not reap. Well, that's just about being active, busy. If you see a job that needs to be done, get out there and do it. If you're running a business, well, the buck stops with you. If you're the business owner, if you're the manager, whatever part of that business you're involved in, make sure that you're doing your very best at it. Because success rarely comes to the daydreamers. And, you take a look, he who watches the wind is not going to sow. If you just spend all day kind of like planning and thinking about your fortune, and someday when all the cards fall, when everything lines up perfectly for me, someday Someday it's all going to happen for me. Well, the person who spends every day just daydreaming about someday is never going to have anything come to him. If you're always daydreaming about someday when you get an inheritance that you didn't know about, or a financial windfall that you weren't anticipating, or a bigger tax refund than you thought you'd get. I mean, life doesn't come easy for people who just sit around and daydream and just kind of look at the wind and watch the clouds and just sort of wait for things to happen for them. Got to get out and make things happen, essentially, is what he's saying. And you don't know, right? In verse 5, you don't know everything. There are some things that you can't plan for when it comes to running a business. There's some things you can't plan for when it comes to investments and finances. There's just some things that you don't know. And so you have to be willing to accept the reality of the unknown, of the unpredictable. Sow your seed in the morning, don't be idle in the evening. You don't know. There he says in verse 6, you don't know which one is going to be effective. You don't know this business connection that you make over here or this one over there. I mean, this is the old idea about making business cards. I mean, if you're going to start up a business, making business cards or having a website, right? Having some kind of visibility, that's rule number one. You can't start a business and then just sit in your living room waiting for things to happen for you. You may hand out 1,000 business cards and get 3 business contacts out of it. But you never would have gotten those 3 business contacts if you hadn't handed out 1,000 business cards. And so you don't know what's going to pay off. You don't know which handshake is going to get you in the door. You don't know which phone number it is. You don't know which social event. You don't know what is going to be the thing that gets your business rolling, where success is going to be found. So, try everything. Be open. Be accessible. Be aggressive when it comes to pursuing business opportunities. And the light is pleasant, he says in verse 7. It's good for the eyes to see the sun. That's a transition point into the latter half of chapter 11, but I do think there's an application here as well. There's a lot of things that are unpredictable in this world. There's a lot of dangers out there. There's a lot of investments that you're going to make that won't pan out. But you have to remember that the light is meant to be a good thing, that existence on planet Earth does have beauty to it. And that just because things don't always work out for you, that doesn't mean that you're always going to be deprived of every joyful experience. Life is meant to be enjoyed as we have opportunity. And so don't let the bad news of today ruin your future prospects for joy in this life. Now, we'd be remiss if we said that chapter 11 was just all about good business sense. I think within the scope of the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon intends for us to find something deeper from this passage. Now, these sayings, these proverbs that he offers in these verses, they might have come from business experiences of Solomon. They might have come from personal experience of his in making investments and building business partners and in increasing his capital and increasing his wealth and his kingdom. That's maybe where it began. But surely there's something deeper going on here. I think when we talk about investments and the importance of diversifying your portfolio and taking advantage of opportunities and handing out business cards, are we really just talking about money or the stock market or opening up a new business or international shipping lanes? Of course not. We're also talking about seizing the opportunities that God has given to us to find the spiritually empowering truths, the wisdom that can only be found in God alone. Salvation, forgiveness, mercy, knowledge. Remember in the book of Proverbs, presumably the same writer, Solomon, said that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And we must seek knowledge of the Holy One. Do you apply the same wisdom from a business to your spiritual life? Because if this is just common sense over here, if there is common sense and good wisdom to be found in just business practices, Surely there's an application to your spiritual life as well. Maybe there's an application in terms of personal evangelism, that we need to be very careful with personal evangelism, that as we're going out there, we're not being really selective about the people that we talk to about the gospel, but that we're diversifying when it comes to the people that we talk to about the gospel. That we're not just talking about handing out 1,000 business cards for a landscaping business, but we're handing out 1,000 business cards for the church, or 1,000 flyers for a gospel meeting. Every handshake that goes toward making a business connection, a potential client, for example, is also a handshake where we're making a human connection with a soul that needs to be saved. Don't limit yourself when it comes to your spiritual opportunities. Because again, if these things are true, if this is just good conventional wisdom, if this is just truth when it comes to business practices, how much more true should these things be with the more significant aspect of our life, our spiritual life, our souls, the way that we interact with other people, and the way that we interact with God. So again, this transition point, picking up again in verse 7, the light is pleasant, and it is good for the eyes to see the sun. If indeed, he says in verse 8, if indeed a man should live many years, let him rejoice in them all. Let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. Everything that is to come will be futility. Rejoice, young man, in verse 9. Rejoice during your childhood. Let your heart be pleasant during the days of your young manhood. And follow the impulses of your heart and the desires of your eyes. Yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all of these things. So remove vexation from your heart and put away pain from your body, because childhood and the prime of life are fleeting. There are things in this life that are meant to be enjoyed. We are allowed to enjoy nature. We are allowed to enjoy food. We are allowed to enjoy friendship. Within the proper context, as God defines it, we are allowed to enjoy sex. We are allowed to enjoy a great many things in this life, so long as we understand their context as God defines them. The morality and the ethics that we find in the Bible, in the Scriptures, truth from God. And I think that's the warning that's built into these verses. He says, if you live many years, enjoy them. Rejoice in them. Go out and have a good time. Remember, there will be days of darkness. Not every day is going to be great. The weather isn't going to be great every day. It's not always going to be sunshine. It's not always going to be a cool breeze. There are going to be hot days and humid days. There will be cold days. There will be flooding. There will be storms. Some days you're going to feel better than other days. Your back's going to hurt. You'll get the flu. There will be dark days, and there will be a lot of them. And so when the days aren't dark, and when you have an opportunity to enjoy life for what it is, enjoy it. Rejoice in this life that God has given to us, because it is, at least it can be, a very beautiful, very pleasant life. Rejoice, young man, during your childhood. That's certainly not going to last forever. You're not always going to be as young as you are right now. And maybe you're watching this video and you're not young, or at least you don't feel like you're young. Well, you can look back on those years of youth and remember how nice it was. How nice it was when your feet didn't hurt, when your back didn't hurt, when you had the energy and the vigor to do things that maybe now are just not realistic for you on a physical level. Rejoice, young man. Rejoice, young person, while you still can in these things. Because this is not going to last forever. This is not going to last forever. Let your heart be pleasant during the days of your young manhood. Now, he says an interesting statement in verse 9. Follow the impulses of your heart and the desires of your eyes. Some people wonder, is Solomon just saying kind of do whatever you want, that, as long as you're young and carefree, just go sow your wild oats and engage in whatever you want, sleep with whoever you want, drink whatever you want, eat whatever you want, put into your body anything you want. Is Solomon just saying when you're young, that is the time to just run wild? Cast morality out the door and just do whatever you feel like. Is that the point he's making in verse 9? Well, of course not, because if you keep reading, he goes on to say, yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all of these things. So remove the vexation from your heart and put away pain from your body. I think when you add those two statements in, what he's saying is, live a happy life and follow the impulses of your heart, as long as you keep in mind the judgment that's coming. Remove vexation and pain in that next verse. I believe what that's saying is there is a way to live joyfully without the pain and vexation that sin brings with it. Because if you try to pursue joy by sinning, there's always going to be a hidden cost. And we've made this statement in other classes. I think you can see this clear from the book of Proverbs as well, that sin always comes with fine print. Sin always comes with a deferred cost. Maybe at first you don't see it. Maybe at first the sin seems fun. But in the end, it always bites. In the end, there's always a cost that you don't realize. And so as you go through your life following the impulses of your heart, just keep in mind that God is going to judge you for your behavior. So live in the light of that judgment. While you're young, you're going to have opportunities to travel, opportunities that probably won't exist when you begin with a career and you get settled into a routine and you start to have a family. You're going to have opportunities to take up new hobbies. I mean, all the time. If you feel like playing the mandolin, like when you're 20, play the mandolin. Go ahead, play the mandolin. You want to go whitewater rafting? Great, go whitewater rafting. You want to go skydiving? Awesome. Go skydiving. You know, when you're young, do it. Go for it. Have 5 or 6 or 10 or 12 different hobbies and go for it and try a lot of different things. And if you're not sure what you want to do for a living, if you're not quite sure what you want to do as a career, well, you know what? Try a couple of different careers. Take a lot of different classes in college. Those first few years, your freshman, your sophomore year, take a lot of different classes. Take an engineering class, take an architecture class, take a philosophy class. You know what? Go for it. Because those opportunities aren't going to exist later on in life, at least in the same way that they exist when you're young. And so when you're a young man and you're a young woman, follow the impulse of your heart. Just remember that God's going to judge you. So don't do anything with the impulses of your heart. Don't do anything with your youth that's going to jeopardize your standing with God in the judgment. In short, just make sure you don't sin. Have fun. Just make sure that you're not sinning while you're doing it. Childhood and the prime of life are fleeting, he says at the end of chapter 11, which leads directly into the first verse of chapter 12. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near when you will say, I have no delight in them. That's one of the things that young people tend to forget about. In the midst of all of this discovering yourself, in the midst of all these hobbies and these pursuits, in the midst of a busy class schedule, your first few years of college, in the midst of dating somebody or even planning for a wedding, in the midst of all the excitement of being young, I think one of the things that we forget about most often is to remember our Creator in the days of our youth. I don't care if you're 18 or 20 or 25 or 30. I don't care. I don't care if you're just starting a career, if you're wrapping up college. I don't care if you're just, if you're Twitter-pated with the love of your life, right? It doesn't matter. You got to love God first and foremost. You have got to remember your Creator. He holds your destiny, your eternal destiny. He holds judgment in His hands. Your very soul has been entrusted to Him. Don't do anything in your youth that's going to endanger that. Don't forget to worship God. When you leave home, you go away to college, don't forget to find a church family wherever it is that college is located. And commit to a congregation and be faithful in your attendance and be active in that congregation. Participate in the Bible classes. Participate in the evangelism. Participate in the worship service. Be active in a congregation. Don't forget that. You're going away to college to learn a vocation or a career. You're going away to college to discover yourself, perhaps to find a mate. Well, you also need to be an active Christian. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth when it is so easy to forget about Him. Because when you're young, you got your whole life ahead of you, right? Hypothetically, when you're 20, you're thinking, well, let's see, if I do the math on this, I got like 100 more years, right? I'm only 20 years old. I've probably got 100 more years of life ahead of me. Sure, we'll go with that. But maybe you don't. Maybe you don't even have 100 days left. Maybe you don't even have 100 seconds left on this earth. At any moment, your life could be over. And so, in the midst of your great revelry, the time of joy in your youth when you think that your whole life is ahead of you and you're always going to have time and you're always going to have an opportunity to change later or repent later or worship later or study the Bible later. There's always going to be time for that later. You don't know that. And you may not have a whole lot of time left. Now, even assuming if you do, let's just say you do live that 60 years, 70 years, 80 years. Let's say you do live 100 more years. Who knows what it's going to be like 100 years from now? Medical technology and all that. Or we could be in some kind of like Mad Max-style post-apocalyptic wasteland. But let's be optimistic about it here. Is your life, physically speaking, going to be the same as it is right now? At 80 years old, is your life, physically speaking, going to be the same as it is at 20 years old? Well, of course not. And if you're naive about that, you're in for a very rude awakening. A rude awakening, by the way, that Solomon is about to elaborate on here in chapter 12. Let's pick up our reading again in verse 2, where he talks about there will be evil days that come, many years that will come where you will say, I have no delight in them. So he says in verse 2, in a poetic description of what old age is going to be like. He says, before the sun, the light, the moon, and the stars are darkened, and the clouds return after the rain. In the day that the watchmen of the house tremble, and the mighty men stoop, the grinding ones stand idle because they are few, and those who look through windows grow dim. He's going to use symbolic language to describe what old age is like. Now, I'm going to be 37 here in a couple months, so I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I understand exactly what Solomon's talking about. I've not been through this yet, but perhaps a lot of the viewers out there have. Maybe you can sympathize with what Solomon is saying in these verses. In each of these little symbols, each of these little poetic descriptions of old age, he's going to try and help us understand what it's like to go through that period of life. The sun, the light, and the moon, and the stars will be darkened, and clouds return after the rain. These are the dark days of old age, when you're susceptible to illnesses, when you're susceptible to injury, when you're susceptible to loneliness and depression. He says in verse 3, in the day that the watchmen of the house tremble and the mighty men stoop. I think what he's talking about there are your muscles and your bones, your back and your legs, right? The mighty men, the things that you used to really depend on, right? You used to be able to hike up mountains, and you did rock climbing, and you go out kayaking, and you could lift heavy things and move a rock, and all the things in your body, like your legs and your back, the things that you used to be able to depend on, they're going to start to lose their power and lose their strength. The mighty men stoop. The back begins to stoop over. The grinding ones stand idle because they're few. What do you think he means by that? The grinding ones start to lose your teeth. Those who look through windows grow dim. looking through windows, your eyesight begins to fade. The doors on the street are shut as the sound of the grinding mill is low, and one will arise at the sound of the bird, and all the daughters of song will sing softly. I think what he's talking about there is how elusive sleep often becomes for elderly people. Now, I know this is not the case for everybody, but in many conversations that I've had with my elderly brothers and sisters in Christ, what I've learned is that sleep becomes very difficult. I know, in fact, several elderly people who've made the comment that they're lucky if they just get 3 hours of sleep a night. And they do everything that they can to try and, keep that sleep, right? Once you fall asleep, it's such a blessed thing. But they end up staying up very late. They just can't fall asleep. And then they end up waking up very, very early. And I think that's what this verse is talking about is, the one will arise at the sound of a bird. You become very sensitive, right? You become sensitive to sounds and sensations, and sleep becomes very elusive to you. Furthermore, men are afraid of a high place and of the terrors on the road. I think when we become elderly, we understand that our bodies are more frail and that we really can't do the same things that we used to do. We become more cautious about climbing up on ladders. We become cautious about athletic activities or physical feats. We become very cautious about being in the outdoors. We become very cautious about driving, about the weather, about slipping and falling and breaking a bone. He goes on to say, the almond tree blossoms. What does almond tree blossoming look like? Well, it's white. He's talking about your hair. When the almond tree blossoms and your hair turns white. The grasshopper drags himself along, something that we normally think of as being very exciting, right? A grasshopper has a bunch of energy, right? He bounces, he hops, he moves here and there. Well, the grasshopper starts to drag himself slowly. There isn't that energy and zeal that there used to be. And the caperberry is ineffective. Well, we'll just kind of let your imaginations fill in that, but the caperberry was used as an aphrodisiac in this time period. So when you reach a time in your life where even the aphrodisiacs don't help anymore with certain areas of your life. For man goes to his eternal home while mourners go about in the street, right? We die and we leave all these people behind. We die and I guess what we leave behind is just the memories and relationships that we no longer get to share, at least in this earthly life. Verse 6, remember him before the silver cord is broken and the golden bowl is crushed. The pitcher by the well is shattered and the wheel at the cistern is crushed, right? You used to be useful. You used to be a tool, an implement. You had a job, a career. You had skills. When a friend needed help moving in, right? You could volunteer and say, I'll help you move your furniture in. Sure, I'll get one side of the couch. Yeah, let's go ahead and tackle the refrigerator together. Put it on a dolly and get it in the house. You used to be the person that went and helped people move in. You used to be the person that when wood needed to be chopped, you go chop wood. You used to be the person when your friends said, let's go camping. You'd say, yeah, let's go camping. Let's go whitewater rafting. Let's go hiking. You used to be the person. You'd tackle big jobs. Go on adventures. And now the silver cord is broken. The golden bowl is crushed. The pitcher and the wheel, they're shattered, snapped in half. They just don't work the same as they used to. And in verse 7, then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. That is the end of every person. It was predicted almost from the very beginning. In Genesis chapter 3, after Adam and Eve committed their sin and were confronted by God, God brought a curse upon them. Death came into the world, and Adam and Eve were going to be susceptible to that death. From the dust, man was brought forth, and to the dust he'll return. Yet there is a part of us that remains. You might even say it's the more substantial part. That when the body is shed and it decomposes and just becomes dirt in the ground, There is an everlasting, there is an eternal component to us that continues to exist. It returns to God. It is the Spirit. It is the soul. It is our essence. And that is the thing that will last forever. That's also the thing that's going to be judged. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. All of it is vanity. So we come to the final section of the book in verses 9 through 14. He's bringing all of his thoughts together. Solomon, the wise. Solomon, the wealthy. Solomon, the great king. Solomon, the temple builder. Solomon, the man with 700 wives and 300 concubines. Solomon, the man who, in the latter part of his life, allowed those wives to take his heart away from God. Solomon, who wrote the book of Ecclesiastes now from the perspective of an old, broken man with regrets, with guilt, with wasted life and wasted opportunities, has now written a book expressing his thoughts. He starts the book by saying, vanity of vanities, all of it is vanity. He explains later on that he had taken his wealth and tried to find some joy, some happiness apart from God. Can I just use my palaces and my treasures and my riches, my slaves? Can I use all of these things, these earthly treasures, and can I find happiness without God? And it failed him. So he thought, wisdom, that's the key. Wisdom, if I'm just smart enough, if I'm just enough, if I'm wise enough? Vanity of vanities. What about society? What about human relationships? Vanity of vanities. Youth, vanity of vanities. Perspective, old age, vanity of vanities. In addition to being a wise man, he says in verse 9, the preacher also taught the people knowledge. He pondered, he searched out, he arranged many proverbs. The preacher sought to find delightful words and to write words of truth correctly. You can look at the book of Proverbs, for example, for a compilation of many of the wise sayings of Solomon. The words of wise men are like goads, and masters of these collections are like well-driven nails. They are given by one shepherd. Truth has as its ultimate source one God. There is one God. There is one Lord. There is one Creator, one truth giver. So all truth, if it is indeed truth, has as its source the one and only true God. And if you can live by that wisdom, if you can listen to what Solomon says, if you can listen to what the prophets have to say, if you can obey the message of Jesus, the Son of God, if you can heed the commandments that he spoke through his apostles in the New Testament, if you can live by the Scriptures, the truth that God has revealed through special revelation, you'll be like a well-driven nail, firm. You'll last. You'll have a foundation, immovable, strong, certain, faithful. But beyond this, my son, be warned, he says in verse 12. The writing of many books is endless, and excessive devotion to books is wearying to the body. He says that nothing wrong with study, nothing wrong with reading and writing books. Just be careful you find balance in life. Don't just read the books, don't just study the books, don't just write the books. Live by the wisdom. Because if all you do is read and write, and you just live your life in hypotheticals, well, you're not really living your life. So the conclusion is this in verse 13. When all has been heard, make sure that you fear God and keep his commandments. Live by the commandments is what he's saying. Don't just read them. Don't just know them in theory. Don't just think about the hypotheticals. Don't be an empty moralist. Obey God's commandments. Because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. That applies in equal measure to you as well as to Solomon. To everybody who has ever lived, you have one truly great commandment, which is to obey God, to love him with all your heart, and to fully give your life over to him. God made you. God made me. God made great men like Solomon. God made each and every one of us. He imbued our physical bodies with an everlasting soul, and it is that soul that will then stand before the judgment seat of our Lord and our Maker to be judged for everything that we've done. Even the hidden things, even the secrets that you've kept, whether you've done good or you've done evil. I hope the book of Ecclesiastes has been it's been interesting to you. It's certainly an interesting book to me. It's my favorite book from the Old Testament. But I also hope it's been a convicting book to study, and that it has motivated you to make the changes in your life that you need to be right with God. If you want to study further, or if you have any questions about Ecclesiastes, or if you have any questions about the Bible itself, reach out to the East Shelby Church of Christ, and we'd love to study with you. We'd love to make sure that based on what we read in the Scriptures together, that you're living the way that you need to be right with God. As always, my friends, I certainly hope that you're having a blessed day.